Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Shadow and Sun Show, and welcome to part 2 of easy mode versus hard mode. Over the years, I've noticed, and mind you, it's been quite a while because I'm going back to AD&D, even White Box through from second edition on. Every rule set that I've come across has tried to make certain things harder that didn't need to be harder and didn't really do anything but make the game harder when there's so many more eloquent, more interesting ways to make the game more challenging. Harder if you want, if you are, of the mind that the more deaths, the more PC deaths that you can rack up, the better DM you are, or the more fun it is for you, or the better a DM you are because you're killing people off. You can literally kill people off without even trying. Therefore, that's kind of the exact opposite of what it means to be a game master, a dungeon master, a referee, etc. You have all the power. You could make the game as easy or as hard as you want, without cranking up the difficulty in the written rules that exist. In the old days, magic user never had to roll to cast his spell for a reason. They got so few of them to begin with, and the likelihood that they picked the right spells for the day, was a crapshoot. You could literally, you could max out the cure light wounds, and then that day what you really needed was a bless or a detect magic or informative spells or protection spells versus cure light wounds. Or maybe you picked protection from evil and bless and things like that, and those didn't mean shit because the monsters that you faced had more than a +1 advantage over you, and therefore they were just hitting, and no matter what, cure light wounds would have been better. Okay. Other things, the difficulty in rolls to hit, the difficulty in abilities to turn undead, things like that. They were all fine to begin with, but people thought, well, we got to change the rules and the numbers, so instead of making them easier, we'll go make them harder, and that makes our game better. No, it doesn't. It makes your game harder. That's it. And for every person that quit because the game was too hard, that could be a good thing. But in the long run, even a shitty player can get better, but a quitter can't do anything, and that takes away from the hobby. I've seen the worst players imaginable eventually become some of the better players I've ever known. You got to start somewhere, and making it more interesting to me is making it more challenging, is making it better. Making it harder weeds out the weaklings, but we all start out as weaklings. Every last one of us, human beings, start out as the weakest creature on the planet with nothing built in but the ability to scream for mommy, compared to a kitten, at a couple of days old, will hiss and try to scratch your eyes out if it feels any kind of pain whatsoever. Natural reaction. They got that built in. So for me, what I like to do is look at the party composition. What do they have? Okay, they don't have a cleric. Well, throwing a whole bunch of undead is really kind of a dick move. Playing without a cleric or a priest or a healer or someone who can take on literally 1/4 of all the monsters in the book kind of makes sense. But if for some reason you don't have one, and throwing all of the really easily turnable undead non-stop, kind of just makes it harder, not challenging. It's just like you're saying, haha, I know what you've got, therefore I'm going to put this in there, unless, beforehand you let them know, hey, there's going to be a lot of undead. You might want to, have someone who can deal with that. Okay, if still they say no, at least you've given them a heads up. But back to, I like to look at the composition of the party and try to make things for give each player an opportunity to have something to do, not just fight. Because a lot of characters that are not fighters, they're magic users, they're clerics, and they're thieves. Okay, from the basic 4 food groups. So it stands to reason that you would want to make 75% of the game not combat oriented, or at least 45 to 55% of the game not combat oriented. Thus, actual role playing, or problem solving, mystery solving, clue finding, exploration, and sometimes just doing the hard work. So when I make up encounters, I don't just throw like overwhelming numbers or a whole bunch of kobolds or a whole bunch of goblins or things like that. If I'm going to throw some goblins, well, if you look in the goblin, kobold, orc, hobgoblin, any of those, one hit die or less monsters, or even whatever, the monsters that can come in the hundreds, you'll notice that for every 10 or 20 or whatever, there's a this guy who's a little bit better, and that guy who's a little bit better. And if you get enough, there may be a witch doctor, a shaman, some sort of spellcaster of their own, throwing those guys in earlier instead of having them to slog through hundreds and hundreds of orcs and goblins. Maybe give them the opportunity to kind of cut the head of the snake off, even at a low level, is far more interesting and more challenging, because now the party is say the party is a group of 7, right? And so they come across a group of, let's say, goblins, and you go, I'm gonna make it like 15, but one of them is like, maybe he's a 2nd level shaman, so he can cast 2 or 3 spells a day, and you pick those spells out, and now in addition to fighting like a sub chief and a bunch of weenie monsters, there's also this little spellcaster who may have a couple of spells up his sleeve. Maybe even he's got some magical powder or poof dust or something that they're not expecting, versus just overwhelming numbers and that 15, those 15 goblins just get 2 attacks per each guy because they double up, and you just they can't win. Even though they have crappy hit points, they still get more chances to hit. And if everybody's using a D6 weapon, it's no different by much than what the player's dishing out. Chances are you're gonna take out a bunch of characters. Same thing with like bandits or even some of the bigger monsters. Like, most of my players know that in the early days you're not going to fight goblins and kobolds and orcs and those one hit die masses. I might throw some lizardmen at you. I might throw an ogre, and the whole party, every single one of you, is going to have to freaking dive on that one guy, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles versus Splinter style, and get him from every angle. So the thief gets to do a backstab, and maybe he only rolls a 3, but that turns into 6 points because it's double damage. That's pretty significant. The fighter is, holding his own with the shield up front, occupying most of his attacks. Maybe he's hitting the shield and, missing because, whatever. And the cleric could be, doing his thing, maybe healing the fighter so the fighter can stay in there. The magic user will hit him with the magic missile. Okay, spell's gone, but hey, I did a guaranteed, 3 or 4 points of damage. And make it more interesting, more memorable, instead of, wave after wave after slog of forgettable encounters. That can get really boring. And, when you're doing that, if you're using any kind of, realism or, outnumbering dice, it's just going to wear them down to nothing. And what do they get for it? A handful of silver. At least when they kill the goblin shaman, they can say, hey, remember when we killed that goblin shaman and he blew that weird dust at us? That's far more interesting than, remember that one time I rolled a crit and lopped off that goblin's head? Yeah, which goblin, which head, what encounter? It could be any of a dozen, such encounters. It doesn't really become memorable. And for me, that's the challenge, is to make every encounter more interesting. Use stuff you've never used before. Use stuff that they may never have encountered before. Find those off the wall offbeat monsters, creatures, even NPCs can be, a big problem, especially, a party. The old days, parties would run into other adventuring parties. Kudos to Bubba, we did that in the last game. We saw, we met. It was only a party of like 3, but they were still higher level than us, and we weren't gonna, try and freaking murderate them. But it was interesting, and you could develop a rivalry. Yeah, sure, you had to work together, but you'll start to see, the such and such gang was here. Haha, we beat you to it. Stuff like that. It doesn't have to be like hostile. It could just be, competitive adventuring groups competing to get to the dungeon and get to the MacGuffin first. That's far more interesting and challenging and fun than, we ran into another dungeon full of orcs and skeletons. Kind of been there, done that. Obviously not everybody has, and for those people who are just getting into it, I hope you enjoy the hell out of it. Just remember, always bring a cleric. And for you DMs out there, more complicated, more difficult rules don't make the game better. They just make the game more complicated and harder, and in a lot of ways less interesting, because it's like, oh, so you just made everything harder in the way of numbers, but there's really no originality, no pizzazz. Just everything's just harder, so that makes it better. It doesn't. But that's what I've got for you guys this morning. I will be back in 45 minutes with the Tuesday edition of Second Breakfast. Remember, your Craft Challenge Super Soakers are due by the end of Tuesday, midnight my time, your time, kind of, because I'll be asleep, and I'll wake up Wednesday morning, and hopefully everybody will have seen the pictures, voted, and then we'll show off who won that particular challenge. But until then, folks, have a great day. Love you guys, and as always, happy trails.